Hello again. In this segment, we're going to be talking about vulnerabilities and attacks. And so, as you can see on the screen there, one of the most successful types of attacks is social engineering. People are always the weakest link when it comes to cybersecurity. That's why it's so important to educate your employers and people at your company and provide not just like a one-time class or something like that, but continual education, keeping them up to date on different standards and practices and ways that they can help mitigate different threats and attacks and things like that. And really just to kind of show them to be more aware of, potential vulnerabilities in regards to social engineering. How to kind of spot things that could potentially be a type of social engineering. Because that's one of the most common ways that people get into systems. They talk to people, they social engineer people, get them to reveal information that they might not otherwise, whether they're posing as someone from the IT department or someone higher up in the company or whatever the case may be. There's many different ways that people can social engineer, and so the whole point of it is to get those employees, those people, to divulge information that they shouldn't, that can potentially compromise a system. And it is very effective. And so kind of one of the best ways to help mitigate that is, again, to educate those employees and provide them training on how to spot phishing attempts and things like that. All right, so when we're talking about a vulnerability, what we're really talking about is the potential to be exposed to an attack or some type of harm, right? It's not the attack itself, it's the possibility of being attacked, right? That potential for being exposed to it. That's what a vulnerability is. Coming from the Latin word meaning wound, right? A vulnerability is just that. It's like, you're vulnerable to these types of attacks. And so when we're talking about vulnerabilities, we can typically place them into one of four categories. The first one being platforms. And so each type of platform does have its own degree of vulnerabilities, and some having more than others. One of the most dangerous types of platforms is the legacy platform. And when we refer to legacy platforms and legacy devices, all we really mean is like outdated devices and technology. Things that are not supported by the manufacturer anymore, meaning that there's no new updates or security patches or anything like that. And so because of that, they become a very big vulnerability. And so the other two platforms are on-premise platforms, or on-prem, and cloud platforms. And we know that we are migrating a lot to cloud platforms, and they both present their own vulnerabilities. On-premise platforms used to be kind of like the main platform, and people thought it to be the most secure platform, right? But as our premise and on-prem devices kind of grew, we had to incorporate like more servers and more network resources, and now like support for remote access and all sorts of things like that. And so it resulted in resources that they had to get up and running quickly to maintain their network and business operations and things like that. And so they were implemented and provisioned, but not really adequately configured for security, which led to different types of vulnerabilities and things like that. And so cloud computing platforms were great for helping with that aspect. It allowed for provisioning and easily scaling either up or down your network and resources that are needed, right? And you didn't need to manage any of that, and it was great. But now you're relying on somebody else to provide the security for all of that data and all of those resources, and so that kind of presents its own set of vulnerabilities. And by By definition alone, cloud platforms and cloud computing are designed to be accessed at any time, anywhere, right? And so that in and of itself is a potential vulnerability, and it allows for all of that resources to be under constant attack by threat actors and things like that. So they all have their own set of vulnerabilities. And so the next category that we have is configurations. And configurations can result in vulnerabilities, right? Especially default configurations, right? And there are many times where people, hook up a new device or something like that and just leave the default configuration, and you can just go out on Google and search for the default configurations and get the default passwords and stuff like that, and gain access to anybody that does have those default settings, right? So it's really important to manage those configurations. Another aspect of configurations are different services and different ports that are open on your devices. You need to be aware of which ports are open and which ports you need to be open and which ports you may not need to be open, and kind of manage those aspects of it as well. Also, unsecured root accounts. Typically the default is like you should never use the root account unless you absolutely need to. All users should have their own account, and admins should have their own account with admin privileges, right? Root accounts should not be used whenever possible. Because if that root account is ever compromised, they will have access to literally everything, right? Another weakness as far as configuration goes is permissions, right? Making sure that all your permissions are set as needed. We kind of go by the lowest privilege possible. You give people the lowest privileges that are needed to do their work, so that they can access things that they shouldn't and don't need to. Because you can just, lead to potential threat vectors, right? Potential ways for threat actors to access different files and resources and pivot from that by exploiting those, permission misconfigurations, if you will, right? So yeah, configurations, big potential for harm. The next category of vulnerabilities are third parties, right? We talked about cloud computing, and so we're basically outsourcing all of that to a vendor, to somebody else, to a third party. And it's very common nowadays to do that, to use third parties for different aspects of your business and your structure and things like that. And so that is a vulnerability, because now they have access to your system and to your resources and things like that. And more specifically, kind of the rule of weakest link comes into play here, right? And what we mean by that is, now you're as weak as your weakest link, meaning whichever third party, if they have vulnerabilities and weaknesses, they are now your vulnerabilities and weaknesses now too, because they're tied into your system and they're tied in to your company and resources and things like that. So you inherit all of those weaknesses as well, which is obviously never a good thing. And then the last two categories, we have patches and zero-day attacks. And so patches present their own set of vulnerabilities, especially with you can see on the screen there, patching firmware. That's kind of a dangerous thing to do, because this is, firmware is essentially the instructions or the software that is embedded and has direct access to the hardware. And so if you mess up patching the firmware, you could potentially brick the device or ruin the device and render it inoperable, right? So it can be dangerous to do. Some applications, some pieces of software may not have regular patches, regular updates, so that can cause a potential vulnerability as well, because the longer that they don't have those, then the longer those threat actors have to try and figure out what those vulnerabilities are and exploit them. And then delays in patching when it comes to the operating system. And so with our operating systems, they tend to release patches fairly commonly, right? Windows has like Patch Tuesday, I think it is, where they release patches every week, essentially. And so typically, they are usually a good thing, but they have the potential to be a vulnerability in the fact that they can, work or cause like conflict with other applications and other software and things like that. And so typically in an organization, especially like an enterprise level one, you're gonna have like a test system, where you're gonna have like a simulated like network with hosts and stuff on it that kind of act as like a testing center to like replicate your real actual production network. And so by doing that, you can put out the latest patches and test them out and see if there's going to be any conflicts before you actually roll it out to the real production system and the production network, so that you can discover if there's going to be any of those conflict with other applications or software or whatever the case may be. So it's always a good idea to do that and try and test those patches before just implementing them on your live network. And finally, we have zero-day attacks. 0 days are extremely dangerous because nobody knows about them, right? That's kind of where it gets its name from. You have 0 days of warning, right? This is like when a threat actor discovers a new weakness, a new vulnerability, and they exploit it before anybody even knows about it, right? That's a 0-day attack. So they can be very dangerous because there's no way to protect against it, right? Because people don't even know about this vulnerability until this 0-day attack happens. So they're very, very, very dangerous. And fun fact, right? I encourage you to do some research on an attack called Stuxnet, Stuxnet. This was a government-launched operation on a nuclear facility in Iran, right? In this attack, this Stuxnet worm had 4 0-day attacks built into it. It was one of the most unique and complicated but really impressive attacks out there. And it was, supposedly, nobody ever took credit for it, but it's fairly well known that it was orchestrated by the U.S. And Israeli government. So, kind of cool. Alright, so that wraps up our section on vulnerabilities. Again, we have those 5 different categories that we talked about. First one being platforms, which included on-premise platform, cloud platform, and legacy platform. We also had the category of configurations when it comes to vulnerabilities, third parties, patches, and then 0-day vulnerabilities or 0-day attacks. So I hope this was informative for you guys, and we'll see you in the next segment.